Our next subject is multiple sclerosis. I've always wondered, is there a single sclerosis? And the answer is no, because by definition it has to be multiple. Multiple neurological deficits over time and space. Multiple. Multiple neurological deficits over time and different parts of the brain. Multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis. Has to be multiple. Optic neuritis is the single most common, but it can be motor also. Motor means that they present with weakness. Motor can be also sensory. Motor, weakness, sensory, bowel, bladder. Optic neuritis is the most common over time and space, paresthesias. Now let's look at the etiologies of multiple sclerosis. This is a fast way of saying multifactorial is like saying who's responsible? Everybody's responsible, which is another way of saying nobody's responsible. So what does multifactorial mean? It means everything's responsible. What does that mean? We don't have any idea. We do know that there is a predilection of multiple sclerosis to be outside all the areas that would say have malaria. So the places where you get malaria is the places where you don't get multiple sclerosis. The place where you get multiple sclerosis is where you don't get malaria, because it's either in the north or the south in areas of the cold. Okay, north, very south in areas of the cold. Very warm climates tend not to get multiple sclerosis as much. Why is that? I don't know. Now, there's different patterns of multiple sclerosis, and it basically says, you know what, relapsing, remitting, meaning you get better, and then you get worse again. You get better, and you get worse again. You get better, and you get worse again. And relapsing and remitting means this. You get worse and you improve, and 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 eventually you end up in a wheelchair and ends up bad over 25 years. Primary progressive means you just get boom, down the toilet right away. And secondary progressive is not that much different from the others, but the point is this. Over time with multiple sclerosis, either over 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, you have a pattern of progressive disability. Some people get better in between, and some people just get worse and worse and worse. But the bottom line of this is that you have multiple neurological deficits. Optic neuritis the most common. Paresthesias, motor weakness next most common. Bowel and bladder and spasticity are also common. Mentation stays intact. Mentation stays intact, and that is why the dead last thing to happen is dementia. That is so unusual that many people end up having multiple sclerosis for 25 years and never develop dementia. You develop neurological problems, visual disturbances, motor weakness, might end up in a wheelchair, and die of other complications before you actually ever get your dementia. Now, multiple sclerosis, multiple neurological problems over time and space. You cannot diagnose multiple sclerosis off of a single neurological deficit. I had optic neuritis. I did the slit lamp exam. I looked in your optic nerve. I gave you steroids. You got better. You can't say that that's multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a specific definition. You have to have multiple problems, and you have to have an amount of time in between them. Now, the diagnostic testing in multiple sclerosis is easy. The best initial test is an MRI. The most accurate test is an MRI. The lumbar puncture is rarely, if ever, needed. You might see some increased protein for CSF. You might see a mild increase in cells, but this is small, small, small. As a matter of fact, if you have an increased cell count beyond a certain amount in MS, it means you have an infection, and it's another problem. If you have an increased protein and increased cells, an increased protein and increased cells, if you have an increased protein and increased cells beyond too high a level, it's not multiple sclerosis. It's not multiple sclerosis. If you have an increased protein and increased cells, it should be small, mild, small or mild, okay? MRI. MRI shows you the best initial test and the most accurate test. Multiple plaques within the white matter. Now, the other thing about multiple sclerosis is this, is that evoked potentials, visual and auditory evoked potentials, before we had the MRI, we gave you a visual or auditory stimulus. and measured the amount of time it would take to go through the system, we knew there had to be sclerotic plaques because their impulses were impeded. This test will always be a wrong choice. When you see it in the question, it is never correct. But they've got to have 5 choices, right? What test would you do? A, a CT. B, an MRI. Definitely the right answer. C, a lumbar puncture. D, evoked potentials. E, oligoclonal bands. Well, there's only 5 tests for multiple sclerosis. Visual and auditory evoked potentials is never correct. Oligoclonal. Oligo, like where we get the word oligarchy. Oligoclonal bands. Oligoclonal bands. Oligoclonal bands is a few bands of IgG. Oligoclonal bands is a few bands of IgG in the cerebrospinal fluid. You see them on a kind of electrophoresis of the cerebrospinal fluid. You are familiar with something called a monoclonal band. A monoclonal band you see in myeloma. Monoclonal gammopathy. Increased IgG of one single type. Monoclonal gammopathy of unknown significance. Myeloma, the plasma cells making one band. One thing. One antigen. Which antigen? I don't know, but you're making one antibody against it. Oligo means a few different bands. Oligoclonal bands and CSF, let's be straightforward here. You ready? These 2 tests are only done in the case of an inconclusive MRI. The MRI is 90 to 95% sensitive and specific or more. More than 90 to 95% sensitive and specific or more. Oligoclonal bands is done for that 5 to 10% that's not specific for the multiple sclerosis. If your MRI is inconclusive, then you do oligoclonal bands. If your MRI is inconclusive, then you do oligoclonal bands. That is the only reason for it. Visual evoked potentials is always wrong. CSF evaluation is if the case has some other presentation that makes it look not like multiple sclerosis. So here, if we look at this, do yourself a favor, don't learn the difference between T1 and T2 too much. Pain in the ass. It's an MRI. An MRI shows plaques, shows demyelinated plaques. The lesions can get better, they can get worse over time. Next slide. So the diagnostic tests, the CSF, a mild elevation in cells, but remember the protein should be low. And remember, oligoclonal bands here, only if the MRI is inconclusive. I think you got multiple sclerosis, but the MRI is negative. Now, in terms of treatment, forget about the different subcategories. Forget about the different subcategories. The basic answer for treatment is this. The basic answer for treatment is this, that first you use steroids for acute severe. This is for acute severe. Acute severe is steroids. Then the other question is this. You have different therapies for disease modifying. Interferon is disease modifying. Glatiramur is disease modifying. You're losing your myelin basic protein. Let's replace your myelin basic protein. You see this? Glatiramur, copolymer 1, replaces myelin basic protein. Mitoxantrone is another disease modifying drug that is used if interferon does not work. Steroids for acute disease, acute exacerbations. Steroids for acute exacerbations. Steroids for acute exacerbations, rarely plasma exchange or plasmapheresis. Steroids for acute exacerbations. Disease-modifying therapy is interferon or glatiramur. Now let's look at these other treatments here. Spasticity. Baclofen loosens you. Baclofen looses you. Oxybutynin acts like an anticholinergic for your bladder. Oxybutynin for anticholinergic for your bladder. What if your bladder is too floppy, too loose? Bethanechol gives acetylcholine to your bladder. If you're tired and fatigued, SSRIs. If your bladder is too weak and floppy, give acetylcholine. If your bladder is too hyperreactive, block acetylcholine. If you're feeling spastic, baclofen to unclench you. Multiple sclerosis, multiple neurological findings over time and space. MRI is the best initial test. MRI is the most accurate test. Baclofen unclenches that spasticity. Baclofen unclenches that spasticity and doesn't make you as sleepy as diazepam. My bladder is loose and floppy. Then I give bethanacol, artificial acetylcholine. My bladder is small and tight. I give oxybutynin to relax your bladder. How's your bladder? Tight or loose? Oxybutynin if it's too tight. Bethanacol if it's too loose. Trigeminal neuralgia? Carbamazepine. Multiple sclerosis. Steroids for acute exacerbations. Interferon or glatiramer for acute exacerbations. Are you feeling good about yourself? How much did you learn today? That's amazing. Like all this stuff that took me like 15 years to learn, and you learned it in like 5 minutes. Like you don't even need me anymore. Isn't that wonderful? It's like you don't even need me. You can go out right now and be like a great doc right now. You don't even need me anymore. There's nothing that makes me happier that you don't need me anymore. I'll see you later.